Anger is one of the hardest emotions for us to deal with, right? And we're really not taught how to deal with anger. Most of us don't have good role models for dealing with anger. And so, whether you tend to explode with your anger or suppress your anger, turn it inward, this video will be helpful. I believe I'm going to give you some new ways to think about anger that will help you manage your anger. Again, whether you act it out or act it in, I'm going to share the 5 things you need to understand about anger and sort of integrate to begin to change your relationship with anger. And I will also be sharing some very practical CBT tools for managing anger. All right, let's get into the topic. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, we work with our cognitions, our thoughts, our behaviors, right? And then feelings, and how the 3 of those integrate and weave together. So I want to start with some elements of cognition, how we think about anger. And I believe these 5 items will help you view anger differently. So, number 1, there is a difference between the feeling of anger and then what you do with it. More than any other emotion, we confuse these two with anger. Like, for example, sadness. Like, if we say somebody feels sad, we are mainly thinking about how they feel. They may be also acting sad, or they may be hiding it, right? But we don't confuse the two. We don't confuse the feeling of sadness with the demonstration of it. Because we also know sometimes people cry when they don't really feel sad, and there's all sorts, like, we are aware that there are differences between how we feel and what we show to the world and how we act. But with anger, we think it's all one, and anger is bad. Acting out on anger is bad. I kind of agree. Acting out on anger, not helpful, right? But the feeling of anger is a very valid emotion. There's a good reason you have a capacity to feel anger. It is a healthy emotion. What you do with that anger may not be healthy, but the feeling itself is a healthy feeling. So, incredibly important to begin to separate the feeling of anger from what you will do with it. Many people are afraid of their own anger because they know that if they get anger, they go to rage, right? They go 0 to 100. Well, those are 2 different emotions, anger and rage, which I'm going to get to in a little while. But other people might be afraid of their anger because they stuff it and it leads to depression, right? So I want to encourage you to be open to what the feeling of anger is and how it makes you feel before you do anything with it. And then you'll be open to point number 2, which is that anger has a message for you. And I do have a short, like a 1-minute video on this, but anger communicates something to you. And I tend to think of the things that anger is communicating, usually for me and for most of my clients, fall into one of 3 categories. There's something I call mama bear anger. If you hurt me or hurt my loved ones, rah, mama bear anger. Okay? So anger, we feel anger when we get hurt. When we get hurt, the urge to be angry is very strong, and some of us will never even acknowledge or feel the hurt. So slowing this whole process down so that if you get hurt, you're aware of feeling hurt first. And then if the person's intentionally hurting you, okay, anger makes sense. Maybe they're not intentionally hurting you, right? But we slow it down so that we know why we got angry. So mama bear anger when your feelings are hurt. Number 2, somebody crosses your boundaries, right? Somebody steps on your toe, you get a little, they do it again, you get angrier, 3rd time, roof, right? So when somebody crosses our boundaries, and obviously stepping on toes, that's an example of physical boundary, but emotional boundaries, spiritual boundaries, when somebody tells you what to believe, we tend to get angry when people tell us what we should believe, what we should feel. Boundary violations make us angry. So it's a wake up. My boundary is being violated. And then if I can slow the process down, I can think, what can I do about that, right? Okay, so that's reason number 2. And I know I've got lists and then lists within lists, but hopefully this will be organized enough for you to follow. And then reason number 3, it's not fair. I call that Rosa Parks anger because Rosa Parks and other people of the time got fed up with the segregation in the South. And Rosa Parks was like, nope, I'm not getting off this bus. And that is a very productive use of anger. Anger motivates us to do something about what's not fair in the world. So we'll come back to this because sometimes people can be angry about it's not fair, and the it's not fair story is too big. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But generally, when something's not fair, it makes us angry, and there's a good reason for that. So, again, if we slow the whole process down, we pay attention to the emotion without even thinking, what do I need to do with this? We can then look at what message the anger is giving us and understand what's going on. The third thing to understand about anger is that as a society, we confuse anger with rage, we confuse anger with resentment, we confuse anger with irritability, right? So is it anger that's really troubling you? Or are you constantly irritated, irritable? Is there a reason for that? Can you address that, right? Or is it resentment? And I also have a short on the difference between anger and resentment. And this is super important to understand because anger is a bit more like in the moment, right? I get angry in the moment something happens, I feel anger. Resentment is like simmering, it's toxic, it's a feeling of like, oh, this person always does this, and right? So they're very different emotions, and the solutions for them are different, and the messages for you are different. Number 4, coming to that point of in the moment anger. Anger is a defense mechanism that was very or is very survival based. If we are attacked, right? So when I talked about being hurt, right, I was describing it in today's context, which is mostly emotionally hurt. But if we were being physically attacked, our physiological body preps us to fight, flee, or freeze. And most of us have one of those 3 that we do the most often. But what's happening right before you fight, flee, or freeze is that your body has changed its chemical state the second you are attacked, or I should say, feel attacked. Neurotransmitters called catecholamines are released, giving you a surge of energy. Epinephrine and norepinephrine increase your blood pressure, raise your heart rate. They're all priming you for action, whether that action is to fight or to flee. So your body is flooded with these chemicals. And I'm sure that everybody listening to this can think of situations where somebody says something and boom, you just feel a surge of anger, whether you show it or not. Chemically, there's a very strong reaction in your body, and it's driven by your amygdala and your old brain. These primal responses go way back to reptiles. Like, this is old, old stuff. And what I used to tell couples who'd be in my office fighting is that when you get into that reptilian brain, reptiles will eat their babies, like they'll eat their own eggs. We don't want to be reptiles in our relationships, right? So we need to slow it down with our frontal lobe. We need to engage this part of our brain to say, okay, I'm upset, I'm angry. I'm going to look at the reasons I'm angry, and then I'm going to sort out what's the most effective means of dealing with this. Now, the thing to realize is this enormous chemical rush that requires your frontal lobe to be online to deal with it. Your frontal lobe is the part that slows it down, thinks about consequences, thinks about risk assessment. Do I want to attack this person who's 2 times my size? Do I want to jump out the car and start a fight on the highway? Those are probably dangerous things. My frontal lobe is going to say, let's think better about this. But if our frontal lobe is not online because either we don't practice enough, we give in too often to those chemical surges, right? Or we've had alcohol. First thing alcohol does, sorry to say, is it takes your frontal lobe offline. It takes off your risk assessment and your ability to project into the future. And all of this applies to you even if you are a fleer or a freezer as well, because that chemical response could hit you and zoom, you disappear. but that was actually a situation it would have been more helpful to deal with, right? So as we get into CBT techniques, a lot of the CBT techniques are going to be how to keep the frontal lobe online to manage that chemical surge. Now, that chemical surge really only lasts a few seconds, except that we tend to fuel it. So, number 5 is that our anger is fueled by our story. So, what happens when we get angry is we have a whole story that goes with it, right? Now, in more official CBT language, this is called the interpretation of the event or the appraisal of the event, right? So, you have an event that happens, you think about it in a particular way, and that will impact what emotion you feel. Now, one reason I don't believe that all of our emotions come from our thoughts, which is a very, very popular thing today, and I will even get comments on my YouTube video where people will say, no, it's how you think. Everything's about how you think. No, I'm sorry. If you get one of those surges of anger, like let's say you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts you off and you get this chemical surge, you haven't even thought yet. Those primal reactions happen before thought. Okay, but that's a chicken and egg problem. Well, what happens with this chicken and egg is that even if we have that surge, we still have an interpretation. And holding on to that interpretation will fuel the story. So, really understanding how the story, how the interpretation of the event not only impacted how you feel about it, but also maintains the emotion. Okay, so to recap, the 5 things it's really important to understand about anger so that you can begin to change your relationship towards this emotion and actually have a positive relationship with your anger. You truly can. 1 is to separate the emotion of anger from the actions that come from it. Number 2, look for the meaning behind the anger. What is that emotion telling you? Why are you feeling angry in sort of a short way, right? Because we're going to talk about the story later. So this is really just like, really, what's the meaning of the core anger? Number 3 is differentiating between anger and some of the other related emotions, particularly resentment and rage. They're different emotions. Number 4 is understanding that your body's having a physiological response, which is driven by a survival mechanism. And that will need to be managed by your frontal lobe with a variety of techniques that are emphasized in CBT. And there's other techniques as well, right? It's not like they're the only techniques, but somehow bringing that frontal lobe online to manage the feeling, knowing that the pure chemical physiological reaction really only lasts seconds. Like it's very short if we don't then feed it with number 5, the storyline. All right, so I want to go through how the cognitive behavioral therapy cycle works for anger with you. And I'm going to pull up a slide here that I used in one of my most popular videos, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Exercises. So if you haven't seen that, you can check that one out. It would probably be helpful. But as you can see from this slide, right, we have cognitions, which are thoughts, we have behaviors, and we have feelings, and they all interact each other. You will see that all of those arrows go both ways. So how we think impacts how we behave and how we feel. How we behave impacts how we think and how we feel. And how we feel impacts how we think and how we behave. Okay, I hope I got that all right there. So another thing to keep in mind is that our feelings have 2 parts, really. There's the emotional feeling, and then there's also the physiological feeling, right? All of our emotions are emotional emotions, right, do have some physiological elements that go with them. All right, so let's add in an event here because generally we get angry in response to a particular event. So I'm going to show an event, and some events directly cause a physiological reaction. Other events don't, but how we interpret them causes a physiological reaction. So some events actually kick off this cycle with thinking, the interpretation, right? And some kick it off with a physiological reaction. So let's go to the events that have a direct physiological reaction with them. And those events tend to be ones in which we are in immediate danger, right? So we are attacked by somebody, right? That's immediate danger. Something happens while we're driving a car that's dangerous, right? There's an immediate physiological response in your body. The way our brain works is that it takes information in from the outside, and some of that information goes very quickly to our amygdala and our old brain so that we can have a survival response if needed. Now, the information that goes directly there is not as accurate as the information that then goes into our frontal lobe and we interpret. So we sometimes have these immediate reactions, feelings of fear from something that happens that we don't have all the info before the reaction. I don't know if that made sense, but here. And a great example of this is you're walking down a path and you see something out of the corner of your eye and you jump. Right? Your old brain is jumping, is making you jump, thinking that might be a snake before your frontal lobe has even really thought of the word snake. You've jumped. And then after you jump, you take a second look and, oh, it was just a stick. Okay, so the frontal lobe takes longer to process information, but it can process it more accurately. But if you see that out of the side of your eye and your old brain thinks it's a snake, you are going to jump before you even think about it. So this is a really key thing to think about with anger, because sometimes that physiological reaction hits so fast. Now, in those situations where we're not in immediate danger, right? We're really not. The event happens and then we interpret it, right? Like the little figure here with the gears going, right? Like our gears start churning. And then, because of how we're interpreting the event, we have a physiological response. So in this situation, the thoughts kind of come first, right? And then they cause a physiological response to begin to fuel this cycle. So let's look here at a CBT log adapted for anger. And this first page of this log would be a great thing for you to work with if you're starting this journey of really getting to know your anger. So you can think back on past events where you felt angry. And you can also use this kind of on a daily basis until you really begin to be able to think through your anger more clearly. So the first column here is to jot down the event. What was it that happened? The second column is very important. What were the pre-event emotions? So here's an example. If you're in a great mood and everything's going really well, pre-event, you're just doing awesome, and then somebody's rude to you in a store, you might not even think about it, or you might think, wow, I'm sorry, they're having such a hard day. You will just breeze it off. But if you are stressed and irritated and you already feel like you got put down during the day and your pre-event emotions are not in a good state and you are tense as a wire, someone's rude to you in a store, your anger might flare. So really paying attention to what were the pre-event emotions. Very important, because that's actually a place where you will have more ability to intervene in certain situations. Similarly, when thinking about pre-event emotions, if we're going into a situation and we're already thinking, oh, this is going to happen again. I know it is. They always do this. It really bothers me. And you have already built this up. Then yeah, when that person does it, you'll probably explode. And that is partially resentment, but it might explode either internally, right? Because this is if you repress your anger, or if you let it out, that anger will hit if the pre-event is already beginning the storyline, right? So getting used to really looking at what the pre-event emotions were for you. And then if you're recording an event that happened that day or one that happened, recently where you got angry, what was your automatic behavior? What was the automatic response you had? It could have been to shut down or run away or eat, right? Sometimes people get really angry to emotionally regulate. They go and they buy an ice cream or use a drug or have a drink. There's all sorts of automatic behaviors that we do. Some might be criticizing somebody, snapping, blowing up, throwing something, right? What's your automatic behavior that went with that event? And then let's make note of what's the consequence of that automatic behavior. And also, while you're reviewing this, which cognitive distortions are present. Now, I'm going to get into cognitive distortions a little bit later today, just in a moment. So, right now, if you don't know what I mean, just hang in there because I'll explain it. But we want to look through what the unhelpful thinking patterns are that go with fueling your anger. Okay? So this is a log that you can use. You could screenshot this. You can just jot it down on a piece of paper and begin to work with, to begin to explore some of these concepts, right? And the more awareness we have, like sometimes people want super quick answers. They want, okay, I want step 1, 2, 3. And then actually, if I give them step 1, 2, 3, they don't always like step 1, 2, 3. So, but because I will give you some 1, 2, 3 steps in a moment. But really, this stuff takes exploration and a bit of time. So have a little bit of patience as you begin this journey. All right. And then I'm going to come back to this one after we talk about a couple of techniques, because this would be sort of the part 2 anger log, right? So after you begin to practice some of these techniques, this would be the anger log to use. So again, you can jot down the event, but short, keep it really short. Then write down what techniques did you use to slow the reaction, okay? What was the anger actually communicating to you? Remember when I talked about the real reason you get angry? Usually it's you're hurt, you feel something isn't fair, or someone's crossing your boundaries, right? What was underneath the anger? What's the communication? And then what's the emotion that goes with what's under the anger? So for example, if somebody hurts your feelings and you get angry, the emotion is hurt. The emotion you're skipping over to go to anger is hurt, right? If somebody attacks you or you feel in danger, the emotion you're skipping over is fear. So make a note of what emotion is under the anger. And I'm also going to come out with a video in a couple of weeks on a great visualization to really get underneath your anger. So that's not exactly a CBT tool, but I will be releasing that. So again, make sure you're subscribed if you're not, so you can get that. And then in this log, you can write down what's the new behavior, what's your revised thought, right? Because you'll also be aware of what kind of cognitive distortion went with your interpretation of the event. And then how did you feel after your new thought and new behavior? Using a log like this can be incredibly reinforcing and very, very insightful. It can provide you with a lot of insight. And if you're working with a therapist or a counselor or a coach, you can bring these logs and talk about it. It can be really helpful to verbalize this stuff, also to say it out loud. All right, so the practical tools here. One of the practical tools is to begin to notice which cognitive distortion is fueling your anger. And there's been some research done on this, and almost always, particularly if people have habitual anger, there are certain cognitive distortions that go with the emotion of anger. Now, I do have a video on CBT unhelpful thinking styles that goes into each of these cognitive distortions in a little bit more detail. But I want to cover some of the most common ones that go with anger. One of those being black and white thinking, the other being catastrophizing, and the third will be taking things personally. Now, that's not an official CBT cognitive distortion, but it is. So, a handful of examples. Let's say you don't get a job you really wanted to get. The thinking could be, I always screw up. I never do it right. I always lose, right? Always, always, never, self-blaming. Or let's say you're kind of annoyed at your partner for not doing enough around the house, right? He, she, or they always leaves a mess, right? Never does the dishes, never helps me, right? It gets bigger and bigger, which then is also the catastrophizing, right? They'll never help me. I will always have to do all of this by myself. Black and white thinking, and then catastrophizing. So let's say you get stuck behind a really slow driver, and yet you're on the way to meet an important client, right? It could all of a sudden become, there's no way I'm going to get this job, and it's all because of this person in front of me driving too slow. I don't really want to admit, I left a little too late. No. We'll blame that person. Or if you're somebody who blames yourself, you'll blame yourself. Doesn't really matter. You'll be catastrophizing, right? That your career is over, everything's going to go to hell. You'll probably be homeless in a month. So catastrophizing fuels anger. Now, the third one I mentioned is taking things personally. If somebody is rude to us in a store, for example, and we take it personally, we will get way more angry than if we are kind of like, oh, they're having a bad day. It doesn't have anything to do with me. Same thing in the office if somebody's rude to us, or we feel we've been personally attacked, right? And I have a whole bunch of videos on taking things personally, because even if somebody is personally attacking you, it almost always, I'd like to say always, but again, I don't want to be in the cognitive distortion of always, but almost always it's only about them. It's only about what they think, what they're projecting onto you. It's not about you. So taking things personally can really fuel anger. But if you have a cognitive distortion fueling your anger, beginning to question it and see how you can think about it differently, right? Because a cognitive distortion means it's not true. It's a distortion. It's distorted. It's not accurate. So just know that if you're able to identify a cognitive distortion, there's a different way to see the situation. So that was tool number one, think through the cognitive distortions. Now, tool number two that I'll mention today, although I will have to say this is probably the most important tool for managing anger, and you're probably not going to like this, but diaphragmatic breathing. The only way to stop that automatic physiological response from taking over is to diaphragmatically breathe. When we diaphragmatically breathe, we are communicating to the old part of our brain, which remember doesn't really have language centers, right? Like this is a very old reactive part of our brain. Diaphragmatic breathing communicates, I'm safe enough right now. I don't have to react right away. It's the only thing that can slow things down. Now, another tool that's sort of the same thing that sometimes people prefer is called stop, take 5, and think. Now, what does take 5 mean? Count very slowly to 5, take 5 breaths, turn around 5 times, list your 5 favorite movies, list 5 birthdays you remember of friends or family. Stop, take 5. We want to interrupt. We want to interrupt the automatic behaviors and thoughts that come out of that physiological reaction. Unless you can slow that time period down, it will be very hard to really change how you respond to anger. And again, this applies whether you freeze, flee, or fight. So if you stuff your anger, if you're totally non-confrontational, you're still having a physiological response that makes your old brain think you're in danger. And doing the diaphragmatic breathing, taking 5 calming breaths, will help your body reset so that your frontal lobe can come online and more accurately assess the situation. Tool 3, we have talked about, and there's a spot for it on that CBT log, but think through what is the meaning? What's the anger telling you? Now, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's always crossing your boundaries, right? The situation probably will take quite a bit of thinking through. Like, it's not going to be an automatic resolve if it's something that's been happening over and over. And boundaries are super important for keeping ourselves safe, emotionally safe, physically safe, all sorts of safe. But boundaries are super important. And I'm working on a new program, a new online program about boundaries. So if you're interested, stay tuned. And you could also get on one of my mailing lists if you are interested in this, and you'll hear about it the second I am able to release it. And one of the ways of doing that, of getting on my mailing list, is to download my PDF, Transform Your Negative Core Beliefs. Now, these negative core beliefs, I didn't really weave it all into this anger video today. I'll probably do another one on anger and negative core beliefs, but they might be fueling your anger, or they might be under what's holding you back from addressing some of the situations in your life that are causing you anger. So you can download that PDF in the notes under this video. There's a link. Anyway, boundaries, super important, but it might take some work. It might take being in counseling. It might take taking a program, reading a book, thinking it through, really thinking things through. So, a lot of the times, the situations that are making us angry are things that will take time to address. They're not like, boom, in the moment, I can take care of this by screaming at my partner. No, that's not going to work. Or screaming at my boss, or screaming at the person in the grocery store, or running away from everything, right? Those are not means of actually addressing the true problems. So taking a moment to finding out what that anger is actually communicating to you will then give you information about what work needs to be done to address this issue. All right, so if you've made it this far in the video, congratulations. I can tell you want to begin to have a better relationship with your anger. There are so many other tools, and I am going to try to come out with some other videos that address those tools, but I don't want to overload you in this particular video. And I think, given everything we've talked about, this is a great start. If you need additional help, particularly if you have rage issues and you need an anger management program, I don't provide one, not me, but there are many available and they can be highly effective. And there's a bunch available online now as well. And then counseling can also really help. And since I no longer do counseling, I am an affiliate with BetterHelp.com, which provides therapy in, I think, 140 countries around the globe, 40 different languages. It's online. I've tried their services myself. I became an affiliate because I wanted to have somewhere to refer people. This channel does earn a small commission if you sign up through the Awaken Joy link, which again is in the notes underneath this video. However, you also get 10% off. So it does not cost you any additional amount to sign up with the link. And as I said to start, learning to have a positive relationship with your anger, super important. And good for you for being willing to do this work. All right. See you next time.